Red and blue lights shatter the quiet darkness of a secluded suburban highway. For many, a traffic stop is merely a frustrating delay, a brief interruption of their evening. But when an arrogant officer with a badge, a loaded weapon, and a mind clouded by deep-seated prejudices spots an elderly black man driving a pristine luxury vehicle, a routine patrol becomes a dangerous powder keg. Officer Todd Rexford believed he had found an easy mark to harass just another target to satisfy his unchecked ego. He had absolutely no idea that the quiet, dignified man calmly gripping the leather steering wheel was a sitting state Supreme Court justice. By the time the night is over, a brutal, undeniable lesson in accountability will be served, and a man who thought he was above the law will find himself crushed by it. The damp, coastal air of Fairhaven County clung to the windshield of the police cruiser. It was past midnight on a Tuesday, and the wealthy, insular suburb of Fairhaven was dead quiet. The sprawling estates, hidden behind wrought iron gates and ancient oak trees, were dark. For Officer Todd Rexford, the graveyard shift was usually an exercise in numbing boredom, punctuated only by the occasional noise complaint or a teenager sneaking out. Rexford was a man who wore his badge not as a shield for the community, but as a crown. A 10-year veteran of the Fairhaven Police Department, he had a notorious, quietly whispered reputation. He was the kind of cop who knew exactly where the line was and how to step right up to the edge of it and frequently over it without getting caught. He had a specific profile he looked for. He didn't like outsiders in his town. Tonight, he was restless, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the empty, winding stretches of Willow Creek Road. A few miles ahead, Calvin Winslow was simply trying to get home. At 72 years old, Calvin possessed a quiet, unshakable dignity. He was dressed in a tailored, charcoal gray suit. His tie loosened just a fraction after a long, exhausting dinner in the city with his daughter, a pediatric surgeon who had just celebrated her birthday. Calvin was driving his pride and joy, a beautifully restored midnight blue 1968 Mercedes-Benz 280 SL. He drove with the careful precision of a man who respected the road, keeping his speed exactly at the posted limit of 35 miles per hour. As Calvin's vintage Mercedes glided past the obscured entrance of an abandoned access road, the headlights briefly washed over Rexford's parked cruiser. Inside the cruiser, Rexford sat up straight, his eyes narrowed. In Fairhaven, a classic car of that caliber usually belonged to one of the local tech executives or retired hedge fund managers. But as the Mercedes passed under the ambient glow of a rare street lamp, Rexford caught a glimpse of the driver, an elderly black man. Instantly, the gears in Rexford's mind began to turn, fueled by his own toxic biases. Stolen car? He thought immediately. Or maybe someone who has no business being in this zip code at this hour. He didn't run the plates. He didn't wait to observe a traffic violation. Rexford shifted his cruiser into drive, his tires kicking up a spray of gravel as he pulled out onto the asphalt, accelerating rapidly to close the distance. Calvin noticed the headlights approaching aggressively fast in his rear-view mirror. He checked his speedometer 34 miles per hour. He checked his lane position perfectly centered. He signaled and gently guided his car through a sweeping curve. The cruiser tailgated him, riding so close that the headlights blinded Calvin through the mirrors. "All right, officer," Calvin murmured softly to himself, his deep, resonant voice calm in the quiet cabin of his car. "What is it you want?" For 2 full miles, Rexford rode Calvin's bumper. It was an intimidation tactic, plain and simple. Rexford was waiting for the driver to make a mistake, a sudden break, a swerve, a failure to signal out of sheer panic. But the Mercedes drove flawlessly. Frustrated that his prey wasn't taking the bait, Rexford decided he didn't need an excuse. He reached over and flicked the switch. The light bar erupted, painting the dark canopy of the trees in violent flashes of red and blue. The piercing wail of the siren cut through the silent night. Calvin didn't panic. He had lived a long time in a world that often judged him before he spoke. He signaled, slowed his vehicle, and carefully pulled over onto the wide gravel shoulder of the road, ensuring he was completely out of the lane of traffic. He put the car in park, turned off the engine, rolled down his driver's side window completely, and placed both of his hands visibly on the top of the steering wheel. He waited. Behind him, Rexford threw his cruiser into park. He didn't radio dispatch immediately, a violation of protocol. He wanted to handle this on his own terms. He unclasped the retaining strap on his holster, a subconscious gesture of aggression, and grabbed his heavy Maglite flashlight. Stepping out into the cool night air, Rexford slammed his door and swaggered toward the classic car, ready to assert his dominance. The crunch of heavy boots on gravel signaled Rexford's approach. Calvin kept his eyes forward. Watching the officer's silhouette in his side mirror, he could see the aggressive posture, the deliberate heavy steps. Rexford stopped just behind the driver's side door, intentionally standing in Calvin's blind spot to force the older man to turn awkwardly. The heavy beam of the Maglite suddenly blasted through the open window, shining directly into Calvin's eyes. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Rexford barked, his voice laced with unearned authority and thinly veiled contempt. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't state the reason for the stop. Calvin squinted against the blinding light but did not look away. He kept his hands securely on the wheel. "Good evening, officer," Calvin said, his tone perfectly measured, radiating a quiet authority that Rexford immediately found irritating. "My license is in my wallet, which is in my left interior jacket pocket. The registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. May I reach for them?" Rexford scoffed, shining the light harsher into Calvin's face, sweeping it over the custom leather interior. "Just hand them over. And lose the attitude." "Whose car is this, old man?" Calvin's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but his voice remained incredibly steady. "The vehicle belongs to me, officer. Now, to be clear, I am going to reach into my jacket with my left hand to retrieve my wallet. Is that understood?" "I said get the documents," Rexford snapped, stepping closer, his hand resting menacingly on the butt of his sidearm. Calvin moved slowly, with deliberate, telegraphed motions. He reached into his suit jacket, retrieved a slim leather wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it out the window. He then leaned over, opened the glove box, and retrieved a small folder containing his registration and insurance, passing those out as well. Rexford snatched the papers. He stepped back a half pace and lowered the flashlight just enough to read the documents, though he kept the spill of the light on Calvin. He looked at the name, Calvin Winslow. He looked at the address. It was a residence in the city, not Fairhaven. "Calvin," Rexford said, intentionally using the first name, a classic power play meant to demean. "What exactly are you doing driving through Fairhaven at 1 in the morning? You're a long way from your neighborhood." "I am driving home from a dinner with my daughter," Calvin replied smoothly. "Is there a curfew in Fairhaven County that I am unaware of, officer?" Calvin deliberately paused, waiting for the man to identify himself. "Officer Rexford," the cop sneered, annoyed by the older man's vocabulary and absolute lack of fear. Usually, by this point, the people he pulled over were stammering, apologizing, or sweating. This man was completely unfazed, and it made Rexford's blood boil. "And you didn't answer my question. People don't just cut through Willow Creek Road unless they're lost or they're looking for houses to hit." "Which one is it?" "I am neither lost, nor am I a burglar, Officer Rexford," Calvin stated calmly. "I take this route because it is scenic and quiet. Now, you have my identification. Could you please inform me why I was pulled over?" "I was maintaining the speed limit. My vehicle is in working order, and my registration is current." "You swerved." Rexford lied without hesitation. "Cross the center double yellow line back there by the bend. Look to me like you might be operating under the influence." "I see," Calvin said softly. He knew it was a lie. He also knew that arguing with a man holding a gun on a dark, isolated road was a fool's errand. "I assure you, I have had nothing to drink. And I did not cross the center line." "Step out of the vehicle," Rexford commanded suddenly, his voice sharp. Calvin paused. "Officer, there is no legal basis for ordering me out of my vehicle for a minor, alleged traffic infraction when I have provided all requested documentation and demonstrated no signs of impairment." Rexford leaned down, his face inches from the window, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and chewing gum. "I'm not asking, Calvin. I'm giving you a lawful order. Bye. Step out of the car, or I will drag you out." The silence that followed was heavy, The only sounds were the rhythmic clicking of the cruiser's light bar relay and the distant chirp of crickets. Calvin Winslow, a man who spent his days interpreting the highest laws of the state, weighing constitutional rights, and holding the powerful accountable, found himself at the utter mercy of an armed man who respected none of those things. Calvin slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. "I am stepping out of the vehicle," he announced calmly. He opened the heavy door of the Mercedes and stood up. Even at 72, Calvin was a tall man, standing over 6 feet, though his posture carried the slight curve of age. He buttoned his suit jacket with an air of immense dignity, smoothing the fabric before looking Rexford in the eye. "Turn around. Put your hands on the roof of the car," Rexford ordered. "Are you detaining me, Officer Rexford?" Calvin asked, his voice echoing slightly in the damp night air. "Do it now," Rexford shouted, drawing his taser and pointing the red laser dot directly at Calvin's chest. Calvin turned around and placed his hands flat on the cold metal of his car's roof. He spread his feet as Rexford approached from behind. Rexford didn't just pat him down. He was rough, kicking Calvin's ankles further apart, patting his pockets with unnecessary force, looking for anything, a weapon, a pill bottle, a reason. Finding nothing, Rexford grabbed Calvin's wrists, yanking them down behind his back. "What are you doing?" Calvin asked, his voice hardening for the first time. "I am not resisting. You have no probable cause for an arrest, for my safety." "You're being detained," Rexford growled. The cold steel of handcuffs clamped tightly around Calvin's right wrist, then his left. The ratchets clicked loudly. Rexford squeezed them shut, ensuring they bit tightly into the older man's skin. "These cuffs are excessively tight, officer," Calvin noted, wincing slightly as the metal dug into his bone. "If you'd stop squirming, they wouldn't hurt." "Kanslasis, Kant, Kansaven." Calvin, by the bicep, and practically shoved him toward the police cruiser. "Get in the back." Rexford forced the elderly judge into the plastic-molded back seat of the cruiser, slamming the door shut. He walked back to the Mercedes, grabbed his flashlight, and began an illegal, unwarranted search of the vehicle. He swept the beam over the leather seats, popped the glove box again, rummaged through the center console, and even shined the light into the grill of the air conditioning vents. Inside the cruiser, Calvin sat quietly, his shoulders aching from the unnatural angle of the cuffs. He watched Rexford tear through his immaculate car. Calvin didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply observed, cataloging every single constitutional violation, every broken protocol, every arrogant misstep. His mind, razor-sharp and trained by decades of legal warfare, was already drafting the court orders. After 5 minutes of finding absolutely nothing but Werther's originals and some jazz cassette tapes, Rexford slammed the passenger door of the Mercedes in frustration. He stomped back to his cruiser and climbed into the driver's seat. He glanced back at Calvin through the wire mesh partition. "Nothing to say now, huh?" Rexford sneered. "I have a great deal to say, Officer Rexford," Calvin replied, his voice chillingly calm. "But I will save it for the appropriate venue. You are making a profound, life-altering mistake tonight." Yeah. Save it for the judge," Rexford laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Calvin offered a small, terrifyingly cold smile in the darkness of the back seat. "I intend to." Rexford grabbed his radio microphone. It was finally time to call this in and see if this old man had any outstanding warrants he could use to justify the cuffs. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, Bravo," Rexford said, leaning back in his seat. A burst of static, then the tired voice of the night dispatcher, Sarah, came through. "Go ahead, 4, Bravo. I've got a traffic stop on Willow Creek Road, near the old access gate. 1 detained. Run a 27 to 29 on a Winslow, first name Calvin. Date of birth. Let's see." Rexford squinted at the license in his hand, reading off the birth date. "Copy that, 4, Bravo. Stand by," Sarah replied. Rexford drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, looking at Calvin in the rearview mirror. "Let's see what you're hiding, old man." A minute passed. Then 2. Usually, a background check through the state database took less than 30 seconds. Suddenly, the radio crackled. But it wasn't Sarah the dispatcher. The voice was deeper, authoritative, and carried an undeniable edge of panic. It was the night shift. Watch Commander. Unit 4. Bravo. This is Command. Say again the name and date of birth of the detained individual. Rexford frowned. Why was Command jumping on the channel? Command 4. Bravo. Name is Winslow. Calvin. D.O.B. Is. He repeated the numbers. The radio went dead for 5 excruciating seconds. When the voice came back, it was practically shouting. Unit 4. Bravo. Officer Rexford, do you have Calvin Winslow in handcuffs? Answer me right now. Rexford hesitated, a sudden icy prickle of unease forming at the base of his neck. Affirmative. Command. He's secured in the back of my vehicle pending. Rexford, listen to me very carefully. The watch commander interrupted, his voice shaking. Do not speak to him. Do not touch him. You are to immediately uncuff that man. You have just detained the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. The Chief of Police is on his way to your location right now. Do you copy? The blood drained from Todd Rexford's face, leaving him ashen. The cruiser was dead silent, save for the idle of the engine. Rexford slowly looked up into the rearview mirror. Through the wire mesh, Chief Justice Calvin Winslow was looking right back at him, his eyes like chipped obsidian. The silence inside the police cruiser was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the engine and the harsh, synthetic crackle of the two-way radio. The watch commander's final words hung in the stale air, a terrifying death knell echoing in the confined space. Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. Officer Todd Rexford could not breathe. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly vacuumed from the cabin. The heavy maglite flashlight he had so arrogantly wielded moments ago slipped from his numb fingers, clattering loudly against the plastic center console before tumbling to the floor mat. A cold, prickling sweat erupted across his forehead, the kind of visceral, biological terror that strikes when a predator suddenly realizes it has stepped blindly into a steel trap. He stared at the rearview mirror, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Through the perforated steel mesh of the partition, Calvin Winslow sat with the perfect, unyielding posture of a man accustomed to presiding over courtrooms where men's lives and freedoms were decided. The elderly man's face was devoid of the fear, confusion, or subservience Rexford usually extracted from his victims. Instead, Calvin's expression was one of cold, academic calculation. He was analyzing Rexford not as a threat, but as a fascinating, repulsive specimen of institutional failure. Sir. Your Honor. Rexford stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the mocking swagger he had weaponized just 5 minutes earlier. His hands hovered over the steering wheel, trembling violently. There seems to be a misunderstanding. The lighting out here. The vehicle. I was just following standard protocol for a suspected. Do not insult my intelligence, Officer Rexford, and do not further incriminate yourself by lying to a sworn officer of the court. Calvin's voice cut through the cruiser like a finely honed scalpel. It was low, resonant, and entirely stripped of emotion. You did not follow protocol. You executed a pretextual stop without reasonable articulable suspicion. You fabricated a traffic violation. You conducted an illegal search of my vehicle without probable cause or a warrant, violating my Fourth Amendment rights. And you have effectuated a false arrest, utilizing excessive force in the application of those restraints. Calvin shifted slightly in the hard plastic seat, ignoring the sharp bite of the metal cutting into his wrists. There is no misunderstanding here, Todd. Only the catastrophic intersection of your unchecked prejudice and a man who possesses the authority to permanently end your reign of terror. Rexford swallowed hard, tasting bile at the back of his throat. He reached frantically for the door handle, desperate to get out of the car, desperate to undo the heavy steel cuffs, to erase the last 15 minutes of his life. Your Honor, please, let me get you out of those. We can sort this out. I'll let you go with a warning. We can just. You will not touch me, Calvin commanded, his voice suddenly ringing with the absolute authority of the bench. It was a voice that commanded silence in packed courtrooms, a voice that delivered verdicts altering the course of the state's history. You will sit precisely where you are. You will not exit this vehicle. You will wait for your commanding officers to arrive. And you will face the consequences of your actions. in the blinding light of accountability. "Do you understand me?" Rexford froze, his hand hovering over the door latch. He was paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable gravity of the man in his back seat. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making, and the walls were closing in with terrifying speed. In the distance, the wail of approaching sirens pierced the quiet night. It wasn't just one siren. It was a chorale of them, growing louder, more frantic, multiplying as they echoed through the wealthy, manicured estates of Fairhaven County. Less than 3 minutes later, the dark stretch of Willow Creek Road was illuminated like a stadium. 3 Fairhaven Police Department SUVs came tearing around the bend, their tires squealing in protest as they locked their brakes, fishtailing slightly on the gravel shoulder before coming to aggressive halts, boxing in Rexford's cruiser and Calvin's pristine Mercedes. The doors of the lead SUV flew open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Chief of Police Thomas Bradley, a 30-year veteran of law enforcement who had spent the last 5 years trying to clean up the department's tarnished public image, sprinted toward the cruiser. He was a large, imposing man. His face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. He had been yanked out of bed by a phone call that every police chief dreads, a call that informed him one of his patrolmen had just unlawfully detained the highest-ranking judicial official in the state. Right behind him was Captain Samuel Ford, the watch commander, looking equally pale and horrified. Chief Bradley didn't bother looking at Rexford. He marched directly to the rear passenger door of the cruiser, yanked it open, and leaned inside. The sight of Chief Justice Calvin Winslow, a man Bradley had personally testified in front of during legislative hearings, sitting in the back of a squad car with his hands bound behind his back, sent a shockwave of nausea through the chief's stomach. "Justice Winslow," Chief Bradley said, his voice thick with a mixture of profound apology and suppressed rage. "Sir, there are no words. I am so deeply sorry." Calvin looked up at the chief, his expression remaining unreadable. "Good evening, Chief Bradley. I wish the circumstances of our reunion were more favorable, though I suppose they are highly illuminating. Captain Ford, get those cuffs off him right this second," Bradley bellowed, turning his head but keeping his eyes on Calvin. "And get a medical kit. Now." Captain Ford scrambled forward, his hands shaking as he produced a small universal handcuff key. He leaned into the cruiser, apologizing profusely under his breath as he carefully unlocked the restraints. The heavy metal clicked and fell away. Calvin brought his arms forward slowly, wincing as the blood rushed back into his hands. Deep, angry red indents circled his wrists, the skin scraped raw where Rexford had squeezed the ratchets too tightly. "Sir, do you need an ambulance? We can have paramedics here in 2 minutes," Captain Ford offered, hovering anxiously. "That will not be necessary, Captain," Calvin replied, rubbing his wrists gently. He slowly stepped out of the claustrophobic confines of the cruiser, standing tall in the cool night air. He smoothed the front of his tailored suit, restoring his dignity with a few sharp, precise movements. "But I do require you to retrieve a camera from your vehicle and document these lacerations immediately. They are evidence of battery under color of law." "Yes, sir." "Right away, sir," Ford said, practically sprinting back to his SUV to retrieve an evidence camera. Chief Bradley stood before the justice, looking like a man watching his entire career burn to the ground. "Justice Winslow, I assure you, this is not reflective of the Fairhaven Police Department. We will handle this internally with the utmost severity." Calvin stopped rubbing his wrists and fixed Bradley with a stare that could freeze boiling water. "Thomas, you and I both know that this is exactly reflective of a specific rot within your department. It is a rot I have read about in appellate briefs. A rot that civil rights attorneys have complained about in my chambers for years. Tonight I did not read about it in a file. I experienced it. And let me assure you, there will be nothing internal about how this is handled." While Captain Ford photographed Calvin's bruised wrists under the harsh glare of the cruiser's headlights, Chief Bradley finally turned his attention to the front seat of the squad car. Todd Rexford was still sitting behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, listening to the lever being pulled. "Rexford." Bradley's voice was dangerously quiet, a stark contrast to his earlier shouting. It was the tone of a man who had moved past anger into absolute clinical execution. "Get out of the car. Rexford fumbled with the door handle, his legs feeling like lead as he stepped out onto the gravel. He couldn't meet the chief's eyes. He stared at the brass buttons on Bradley's uniform jacket. "Chief, I didn't know," Rexford pleaded, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "He was driving through the north side at 1 a.m., I thought. I was just being proactive. I was protecting the neighborhood. I didn't know who he was." Calvin, who had finished having his injuries documented, stepped forward. His presence silenced Rexford immediately. "That is precisely the point, officer," Calvin said, his voice carrying clearly over the idling engines. "You didn't know who I was. If you had known I was the Chief Justice, you would have saluted me as I drove past. Your restraint, your professionalism, is entirely dependent on the perceived power of the citizen you are interacting with." Calvin stepped closer to Rexford, who instinctively shrank back against the door of his cruiser. "You looked at my skin. You looked at the neighborhood. Werterdi. You looked at the car. And you made a calculation," Calvin continued, his words landing like physical blows. "You calculated that I was a man without a voice. You calculated that I was a man who could be intimidated, bullied, and humiliated on the side of a dark road without consequence. You believed my word would mean nothing against the word of a sworn officer in a courtroom." Calvin pointed a long, elegant finger at Rexford's chest, directly at his silver badge. "If you are willing to fabricate a traffic violation, falsify a police report regarding swerving, illegally search a vehicle, and apply painful physical restraints to a 72-year-old man in a tailored suit simply because you think you can get away with it, what in God's name do you do to the 19-year-old kid driving a rusted sedan who doesn't know his rights? What do you do to the single mother who can't afford a lawyer to fight your fabricated charges?" Rexford opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The absolute moral and legal devastation of Calvin's words left him entirely defenseless. "You are a predator wearing a badge, Todd," Calvin said, delivering the final verdict. "And your hunting days are permanently over." Calvin turned to the chief of police. "Chief Bradley, this man is a danger to the public. He has demonstrated a gross deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242. He has committed battery. He has conducted an illegal search. I expect immediate and decisive action." Bradley didn't hesitate for a microsecond. The political, legal, and moral reality of the situation demanded a public, immediate decapitation of Rexford's authority. The Department of Justice would be breathing down his neck by sunrise. He had to show that he was taking out the trash himself. "Officer Rexford," Bradley barked, his voice echoing off the silent trees. "Attention." Conditioned by years of quasi-military training, Rexford reflexively straightened up, though his knees visibly knocked together. "Todd Rexford, as of this exact second, you are stripped of all police powers," Chief Bradley declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "You are suspended indefinitely, without pay, pending an immediate investigation by the State Bureau of Investigation, which I will be calling personally in 10 minutes. Furthermore, due to the blatant criminal nature of your actions tonight, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution regarding false imprisonment and battery." Rexford gasped, a pathetic sound of a man watching his pension, his freedom, and his identity evaporate into the coastal fog. "Hand over your weapon," Bradley ordered, holding out his hand. Rexford's hands shook so violently he could barely undo the retention strap on his duty holster. He slowly drew his standard-issue Glock, keeping the barrel pointed firmly at the dirt, and handed it to the chief. Bradley snatched it, cleared the chamber, and handed it back to Captain Ford without looking. "Your radio. Your taser. Your pepper spray," Bradley demanded. Piece by piece, Rexford handed over the tools of his unearned authority. With every item surrendered, he seemed to shrink, physically diminishing from a terrifying figure in the dark to a pathetic, ordinary man standing on the shoulder of a road. "Now the badge," Bradley said. Rexford hesitated. Taking off the badge was the ultimate surrender. It was the symbol that had allowed him to terrorize Fairhaven for a decade. He unpinned the silver shield from his chest, his fingers lingering on the cold metal for a fraction of a second before dropping it into the chief's waiting palm. "Captain Ford," Chief Bradley commanded, "put Mr. Rexford in the back of your vehicle." He is no longer authorized to operate a city vehicle. Transport him to the precinct, place him in an interrogation room, and instruct him to call his union representative and a very good defense attorney. Captain Ford stepped forward, grabbing Rexford by the bicep the exact same way Rexford had grabbed Calvin 20 minutes earlier. "Let's go, Todd," Ford muttered, his voice devoid of any camaraderie. As Rexford was marched past Calvin, he finally looked up, meeting the justice's eyes one last time. He was looking for a shred of pity, a hint of mercy from the older man. He found none. Calvin Winslow's eyes were the embodiment of blind, impartial justice. "You thought you were above the law tonight, Mr. Rexford," Calvin said quietly as the disgraced former officer was led past. "You are about to find out exactly how heavy the law can be when it is applied to you." Captain Ford placed Rexford in the back of the SUV, closing the door firmly. The lock clicked, trapping Rexford behind the familiar wire mesh, entirely at the mercy of the system he had so callously abused. Chief Bradley turned back to Calvin, running a hand over his exhausted face. "Justice Winslow, let me arrange an escort to get you home safely. We will impound Rexford's cruiser, and I will have a full team process the scene properly." "Thank you, Chief," Calvin said, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his keys. He looked at his beautiful vintage Mercedes, the doors still standing open from the illegal search. "I will drive myself, but expect my official statement and a formal complaint drafted by my legal team on your desk by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." "I expect nothing less, sir." Bradley nodded respectfully. And again, "I am sorry." Calvin didn't reply to the apology. He simply nodded, walked back to his vehicle, and climbed into the driver's seat. As he started the engine, the smooth purr of the vintage German engineering filled the air. He put the car in gear and slowly pulled away, leaving behind a scene of shattered arrogance and absolute ruin, driving back into the quiet night with his dignity unbroken. The morning sun filtered through the heavy mahogany blinds of the state Supreme Court building, casting long geometric shadows across the thick carpets of the Chief Justice's chambers. At 7 a.m., the building was mostly silent, save for the hum of the HVAC system and the scratching of a fountain pen. Chief Justice Calvin Winslow sat at his massive oak desk, a cup of untouched, lukewarm coffee resting near his elbow. He was dressed impeccably, as always, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sleepless night. Before him sat a pristine yellow legal pad. Page after page was filled with his sharp, precise handwriting. He was not drafting an appellate opinion or a constitutional review. He was drafting a sworn victim statement. He detailed every minute interaction, every constitutional violation, every physical sensation of the excessively tight handcuffs. He wrote with the clinical detachment of a jurist, stripping away the emotion to present a bedrock of undeniable, actionable fact. Across town, the atmosphere was a stark contrast. The Fairhaven Police Department Union headquarters was clouded with stale cigarette smoke and the frantic energy of damage control. Todd Rexford sat slumped in a folding chair, looking completely unraveled. He wore civilian clothes, a rumpled polo shirt and jeans having been stripped of his uniform the night before. Pacing in front of him was Mike Donahue, the aggressive, veteran president of the local police union. Donahue had spent 20 years burying excessive force complaints and protecting bad cops. He treated every internal affairs investigation as a war. "Look at me, Todd," Donahue barked, slamming his hand on a metal desk. "Stop staring at the floor. We can beat this, but you need to pull it together. Mike, he's the Chief Justice," Rexford whispered, his voice trembling. "The Chief of Police fired me on the spot. The SBI took my badge. It's over. It is not over until a jury says it's over, and we are not letting it get that far," Donahue retorted, his face flushed. "Here is the play. You thought you saw him swerve. That's subjective, but it provides reasonable suspicion for the stop. When you approached, he was uncooperative, argumentative, and reached into his jacket abruptly. You feared for your safety. That justifies the detainment and the cuffs. But he didn't," Rexford said, burying his face in his hands. "He told me exactly what he was doing. He was perfectly calm." "Who else was there, Todd?" Donahue asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Just you and him on a dark road." "It's a he said." "He said," Yes. He's a judge. But you're a sworn officer. We have the dash cam from your cruiser, but we already checked the logs. It malfunctioned. The audio cut out 3 seconds after you hit the lights, and the angle only shows the back of his car. There is no footage of the actual interaction at his window. So, it comes down to testimony. We paint him as an arrogant, entitled politician who thought he was above a routine traffic stop, and you as a proactive cop doing a thankless job. We get a sympathetic grand jury. And this goes away. Rexford looked up, a tiny, desperate sliver of hope igniting in his chest. You really think that will work? I've made worse go away, Donahue sneered. Just stick to the script. You feared for your life. That phrase is your golden shield. At 10 a.m., the State Bureau of Investigation took formal control of the case. Lead Agent David Ramirez, a meticulous investigator known for his absolute intolerance of police corruption, arrived at the Supreme Court building. He was escorted past the heavy security detail directly into Calvin's chambers. Chief Justice Winslow, Agent Ramirez said respectfully, removing his coat. I apologize for the intrusion, sir. I have been assigned to handle the criminal investigation regarding former Officer Rexford. Take a seat, Agent Ramirez. Calvin gestured to a leather chair opposite his desk. There is no need for apologies. You have a job to do. I have prepared a comprehensive sworn statement detailing the events of last night, which I have had notarized. Calvin slid a thick manila envelope across the polished wood. Ramirez took the envelope, feeling its weight. Thank you, sir. I must inform you that the police union has already released a preliminary statement to the press. They are alleging that you were highly combative, refused lawful orders, and that Officer Rexford was forced to detain you for his own safety after you made sudden movements. Calvin did not look surprised. He offered a small, cold smile. I expected nothing less from Mr. Donahue. The instinct to close ranks and fabricate a defense is deeply ingrained in that particular institution. The issue we face, Your Honor, is that Rexford's dashcam mysteriously failed to record audio during the stop, and the visual angle is useless, Ramirez explained, his tone laced with professional frustration. Without corroborating evidence, bringing federal or state civil rights charges becomes exceptionally difficult. It becomes a battle of credibility, and defense attorneys are adept at muddying those waters. Calvin leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, steepling his fingers together. Agent Ramirez, are you familiar with the insurance requirements for classical automobiles appraised at over $250,000? Ramirez blinked, thrown by the sudden pivot in the conversation. No, sir. I can't say that I am. My 1,968 Mercedes-Benz 280 SL is completely restored, Calvin said smoothly. Because of its valuation, my insurance provider mandates the installation of a comprehensive modern security suite. It is entirely hidden within the vintage aesthetic of the cabin to maintain the vehicle's historical integrity. Ramirez sat up straighter, his heart rate accelerating. A security suite, sir? Yes, Calvin nodded. It includes GPS tracking, engine immobilization, and a continuous loop, high-definition, 360-degree cabin and dash recording system. It captures both exterior visuals and highly sensitive interior and exterior audio. It activates the moment the vehicle is unlocked and remains active for 1 hour after the engine is disabled. Calvin opened the top drawer of his desk and withdrew a tiny clear plastic case. Inside rested a single, high-capacity micro-SD card. This contains the unedited, crystal-clear audio and video of the entire encounter, beginning 2 miles before the traffic stop and concluding when Chief Bradley arrived. Calvin said, sliding the small plastic case across the desk, I believe you will find it directly contradicts the union's fabricated narrative. Officer Rexford did not malfunction this camera. Agent Ramirez stared at the memory card as if it were the Holy Grail. A slow, predatory smile spread across the investigator's face. Your Honor, with this, we don't just have a case. We have a guillotine. Then I suggest you proceed with the execution, Agent Ramirez, Calvin said softly. The law is only as strong as our willingness to apply it equally. 48 hours later, District Attorney Evelyn Pierce convened a special grand jury. She did not call Calvin to testify. She simply set up a television monitor in the jury room and played the file from the SD card. The grand jurors watched in stunned, horrified silence as Rexford's belligerent, unprovoked aggression played out in high definition. They heard Calvin's calm compliance, and they heard Rexford's undeniable, arrogant threats. The grand jury returned a true bill of indictment in less than 20 minutes. Todd Rexford was at his home, drinking a beer and watching a baseball game, genuinely believing the union had successfully buried the incident, when his front door was nearly taken off its hinges. The SBI tactical team did not knock politely. They breached the door, swarmed the living room, and threw Rexford to the floor. As he was pulled to his feet, his arms wrenched behind his back and secured with heavy steel handcuffs, Agent Ramirez stepped into his line of sight. "Todd Rexford," Ramirez said, his voice echoing in the quiet suburban living room. "You are under arrest for felony false imprisonment, aggravated assault under color of law, and official misconduct. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you finally start using it." The trial of the state versus Todd Rexford began 7 months later, in late November. The media circus surrounding the case had been relentless. The story of a racist, arrogant cop pulling over the Chief Justice of the state had become a national flashpoint, a perfect, crystallized example of the systemic abuses minority communities had been protesting against for decades. The courtroom of Judge Robert Stanton was packed to absolute capacity. Reporters, civil rights advocates, and off-duty police officers filled the gallery, creating a tense, polarized atmosphere. At the defense table, Todd Rexford looked like a ghost of the man he had once been. He had lost 20 pounds. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame. The swagger, the unearned confidence that had defined his career, was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, trembling terror of a man facing genuine ruin. His defense attorney, a highly priced fixer named Roman Blackage, sat rigidly beside him, projecting a confidence he absolutely did not feel. District Attorney Evelyn Pierce, a brilliant prosecutor with a reputation for merciless cross-examinations, led the state's case. She did not open with impassioned rhetoric. She opened with cold, hard facts. "This is not a complicated case," Pierce told the jury during her opening statement, her voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "This is not a case about split-second decisions in life-or-death scenarios. This is a case about a man who was given the awesome, terrifying power of the state and chose to use it as a weapon to terrorize a citizen based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the car he was driving." Todd Rexford thought he was in a dark place where no one was watching. He was wrong. The trial moved swiftly. The defense strategy was agonizingly predictable. Blackage attempted to argue that Rexford had made an honest mistake regarding the traffic violation, and that his aggressive posture was standard operating procedure for a solo nighttime stop. But then DA Pierce called her star witness. The state calls Chief Justice Calvin Winslow. A hush fell over the courtroom as Calvin entered. He did not look at Rexford. He walked with a slow, dignified cadence, stepping into the witness box and raising his right hand to take the oath. As he sat down, he radiated an authority that dwarfed everyone else in the room, including Judge Stanton. Pierce walked him through the events of that night. Calvin's testimony was devastating precisely because it was devoid of anger. He recounted the tailgating, the blinding light, the fabricated accusation of swerving, the illegal search, and the painful application of the handcuffs with photographic memory. Blackage stood for cross-examination, knowing it was a suicide mission. "Justice Winslow," Blackage began, attempting a respectful tone. "Is it not true that a police officer has the right to order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop under Pennsylvania v. Mims?" "That is correct, Counselor," Calvin replied smoothly. "However, the foundational premise of Mims requires the initial traffic stop to be lawful. As Officer Rexford fabricated the traffic violation, the stop was an illegal seizure from its inception, rendering any subsequent orders fruits of the poisonous tree. Furthermore, an officer cannot arbitrarily escalate a routine traffic stop into a custodial arrest, complete with hard restraints, without probable cause of a crime." There was none. Blackage swallowed hard. "But you can understand how an officer, alone at night, might misinterpret your calm demeanor as defiance?" Calvin finally looked directly at the defense table, locking eyes with Rexford. Rexford physically flinched. "I do not interpret a citizen exercising their constitutional right to ask why they are being detained as defiance, Mr. Blackage," Calvin stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality, and neither does the Constitution. Officer Rexford did not fear for his life. He feared a loss of his absolute control. The final nail in the coffin was driven the next day. D.A. Pierce introduced State's Exhibit A, the video from the Mercedes. The courtroom lights were dimmed. The large screens facing the jury flickered to life. For 15 minutes, the court watched the high-definition, multi-angle footage. They watched Rexford tailgate the vintage car. They heard the clear, crisp audio of Calvin's measured, polite responses. They heard Rexford's sneering, aggressive tone, his illegal commands, his threats to drag you out, and the harsh, violent clicking of the handcuffs. They watched Rexford tear through the glove box and center console without a shred of legal justification. When the video ended and the lights came back up, the silence in the room was deafening. Several jurors were glaring at Rexford with open disgust. The defense rested without calling a single witness. There was nothing to say. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Stanton asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing up. "On the charge of false imprisonment under color of law, we find the defendant, Todd Rexford, guilty. On the charge of official misconduct, guilty. On the charge of battery, guilty." Rexford collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands as a loud, collective gasp went up from the gallery. Donahue, the union rep sitting in the back row, stood up and quietly walked out of the courtroom, abandoning his former asset. Sentencing took place 3 weeks later. Judge Stanton did not mince words. "Mr. Rexford," Judge Stanton said, looking down from the bench with absolute contempt, "you have disgraced the badge you wore. You have betrayed the public trust. You utilized your authority not to protect, but to hunt. It is only by the grace of God that you pulled over a man who had the means, the knowledge, and the fortitude to hold you accountable. Had you pulled over anyone else, they would likely be sitting in a jail cell right now, their life ruined by your perjury. You are a cancer on the justice system, and I am cutting you out." Judge Stanton slammed his gavel down. "I sentence you to 60 months in the state penitentiary. Upon your release, you will be permanently decertified from law enforcement anywhere in this country. You are remanded into custody immediately." Bailiffs moved in instantly. They grabbed Rexford's arms, pulling them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom, the exact same sound Calvin had heard on the dark side of Willow Creek Road. Rexford was led out of a side door, stripped of his dignity, his freedom, and his power, facing 5 years in a facility filled with men he had spent his career brutalizing. Calvin Winslow did not stay to watch Rexford be led away. He had already left the courtroom, walking down the marble steps of the courthouse into the bright, freezing winter air. He had a docket to review, opinions to write, and the endless, heavy work of the law to uphold. The crushing downfall of Todd Rexford served as a seismic shockwave through the state's law enforcement community. It was a brutal, undeniable reminder that the badge is a heavy public trust, not a shield for personal prejudice. Rexford, a man who built a career on intimidation and unchecked bias, was ultimately devoured by the very legal system he so arrogantly abused. He lost his freedom, his pension, and his identity, trading a police cruiser for a small concrete cell. Meanwhile, Chief Justice Calvin Winslow returned to his chambers, continuing his lifelong pursuit of equity. The events on Willow Creek Road prove that while justice may sometimes be blind, it is not deaf to the arrogance of the corrupt. True accountability is rarely swift, but when the scales finally balance, the weight of the law falls hardest on those who mistakenly believe they stand above it.